Hello, guys. Welcome to Mr. Schauber's presentation on the Progressive Era. This is a time in U.S. history, we kind of look at it from about 1890 to 1920, just a few decades there. And it's a time when, because there were a lot of things that we see today as, you know, problems and issues that American society had, especially with workers and voting and things like that, that steps were taken to fix those issues. And so we were trying to make progress, okay, during that time with those issues. And so you can see up here I've written the goals were to do things like end government corruption. Of course, that didn't happen entirely, right? But the steps were taken to try to end blatant government corruption, take care of workers, and take care of poor people, and women's voting rights. Those were kind of the major focuses of the progressive era. And so things like and we'll talk about this, but things like taking care of workers with a standard work day, like a 40-hour work week instead of a 60 or 80-hour work week, paid time off, paid vacation time, um, things like workers' compensation. If a person gets injured on the job, is there a means to take care of them while they recover, or do they just simply lose their job? Things like that. So those are issues that the workers dealt with, and also child labor was a big deal, and the child labor acts to try to reform and get the kids out of the workplace and get them in school, and so this is a time that Americans are trying to make progress in some of these areas. So let's look at this. President Teddy Roosevelt, when he took over in the White House when President McKinley was assassinated, uh, quickly decided he wanted, kind of his catch slogan. He wanted a square deal, a fair bargain or treatment for everyone. And so he went after the monopolies. He went after these big businesses that were controlling, entire markets. He tried to do things to help poor people with better housing conditions. He tried to, like I said, he's going to try to help workers out and workers' rights. So he wants everyone to be treated fairly. At least that's what he says. That's his platform, and he takes steps to do that. And because of this, he's gone down as really one of the most loved presidents in U.S. history. But Roosevelt kind of had his hand in everything. He was a tireless worker. He was going nonstop, tons of energy, and he was really he's kind of seen as one of the real progressive presidents, okay, in U.S. history because of his actions. One thing that Roosevelt felt very passionately about was the outdoors, nature, and he set aside 200 million acres in this country for national forests and things like mineral reserves and water projects. He wanted to preserve nature as much as he could. He loved the outdoors. He loved to hunt and fish and just be an adventurer outside. And so uh, I'll show you in just a minute some of these national parks and things, of course, that were set up. But he he was really Mr. Conservation effort. Okay, was Teddy Roosevelt. Um, and he just that was his thing. And so you'll see here. Let's look at some of the results of his actions. You can see here by 1920 the national parks that existed, and of course most of them are out west. Um, some are back east, but most of them are out west, and including Crater Lake in Oregon and Yosemite and Sequoia in California, the Grand Canyon in Arizona, of course Zion National Park, um, here in Utah, Glacier National Park up in Montana, and Yellowstone, of course, in Wyoming. Some of these are set aside during Roosevelt's time in the White House. Some are set aside before that. Some are set aside after. But Roosevelt had a major hand in getting a lot of these things uh, signed off on. So Yep, there's some of your national parks. Okay, these aren't all of the national parks in the country, of course, but these are some of them, and many of them are done, a century ago. Another issue that happened during the Progressive Era was the 18th Amendment, which prohibited alcohol in the U.S. This is known as Prohibition. There were numerous groups, mainly religious groups, Christian groups, as well as certain women's groups who were pushing for this for years. They thought that alcohol was the source of a major problem in our country, of crime, of poverty, husbands working and spending their money on alcohol instead of their family, things like that. And so various groups pushed to have this passed into law, and it finally was by Congress. It became the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1919. Uh, it will eventually get repealed. It's the only amendment in U.S. history to be repealed by another amendment. It will be repealed in 1933 with the 21st Amendment. So for 14 years, essentially, alcohol was illegal in this country. Now, of course, we'll talk about in the 1920s, which is the only full decade where this applies. Some people followed the law and some people didn't, and it was kind of a running joke, especially in bigger cities. If you wanted to find alcohol, you could. Prohibition didn't really stop anybody that wanted to get their alcohol and break the law, but that's just those were the conditions in the United States. So we had prohibition on the books, but this was one of the things that progressivism pushed for. When Teddy Roosevelt reaches the end of essentially his second term, and the 1908 election is approaching, he decides he wants to be done, and he steps down, and he decides he's going to go hunting and fishing and go on safaris in Africa and down to South America and explore through the Amazon and things like that. And so he basically handpicks his successor, and he's Roosevelt's very popular, and so he tells the American people to vote for his buddy William Howard Taft. And Taft won the election in 1908 and assumed office in 1909. He served for one term. Roosevelt thought that Taft would carry on with his progressive policies, that he would continue to go after big businesses that had monopolies and things like that, and continue to work on uh, workers' rights and things like that. So he kind of just thought, I've left the country in good hands. I'm out of here. I'm gonna travel around the world. And Roosevelt did travel, but when he would hear news about what was happening in the U.S. and when he finally got back to the U.S., he was a little upset and disillusioned with Taft, and he didn't think Taft had truly carried on his policies, Roosevelt's policies. And so, as the election of 1912 approaches, we'll see what happens. But Roosevelt will actually, with being upset at Taft, will actually jump back in the race and try to get the Republican nomination from him, because Roosevelt says, "Well, if you can't get the job done, I'll be president again, and I'll get the job done." We'll get to that in a minute. But Taft was a a big sports fan, loved baseball. Uh, Taft was a very large man. He was probably the heaviest president we've seen. Was over 300 pounds. He was very intelligent as well, though. He loved learning, and he loved this, book studying and things like that. And he after he's done being president, he will actually become a member of the Supreme Court, and he's the only president to ever do that. So that is Taft in a nutshell. But I told you he was a big guy, and probably his most famous, the thing he's most famous for, unfortunately for him, is one time he got stuck in the presidential bathtub in the White House. He got stuck, and they couldn't get him out for a while. And can you imagine being the one that had to get him out? But somehow he got stuck. There is his bathtub, or a replica, I suppose, of the bathtub. But that's a Taft somehow got stuck in that. Of course, there's the political cartoon um, that sheds a little light on the subject. But yeah, I don't know how it happened, but he got stuck, and that's probably what he's most known for. Even though he was overall a decent guy and really smart, but yeah, he's known for being stuck in the bathtub. And here is a true replica of Taft's bathtub. So people were like, "How did he get stuck in there? That's impossible." I mean, it looks like a small swimming pool, but yeah, it happened. Yeah. So as you can see, an essential part of U.S. history right here, right? All right, let's move on. As I mentioned, then Roosevelt gets back and is upset with Taft. And so, as the election of 1912 approaches, Roosevelt wants the Republican nomination, but Taft wins the Republican nomination. And because of that, Roosevelt's followers formed their own political party called the Bull Moose Party or the Progressive Party. And Roosevelt's their candidate, and so he joins the race as the progressive candidate. Eugene Debs was on the socialist ticket, and Woodrow Wilson was the Democrat. Well, because Roosevelt was really more Republican, at heart. I mean, he'd been a Republican, as president. The Republican votes kind of split between Taft and Roosevelt in the end, and Woodrow Wilson will win the election. Uh, but this was a spirited attempt by Teddy Roosevelt to kind of get back into politics and become the president again. And he wanted a continuation of his policies from 1901 to 1908. And so, but it didn't work out. Woodrow Wilson won, and Woodrow Wilson will now be our president. Uh, Long story short, he serves 2 terms, and he'll be our president during World War One. One of the major focuses of the progressive movement was women's right to vote, women's suffrage, they called it. Suffrage is a term meaning the right to vote. And American women activists first formally demanded the right to vote in 1848 at a meeting in Seneca Falls, New York. Now, they didn't accomplish their goal back at that time, but of course this struggle will continue up into the 1900s, in the 19 teens, and finally culminating in 1920. Uh, One of the major leaders of women's suffrage in the United States in the late 1800s was Susan B. Anthony. Also, other women got into the act as well, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucy Stone. And in 1890, they formed a group called the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And this movement gained steam, and more women joined the group. And really by 1900, they were demanding the right to vote. Um, of course, there were people on both sides of the aisle. Some people thought they absolutely should have the right to vote. Other people said no, they shouldn't. For ridiculous reasons. But that debate kind of raged for about 20 years until finally um, other women kind of took over what Anthony and Stanton and Stone had started, and women like Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul and Lucy Burns eventually saw women's suffrage accomplished. And in 1920, with the 19th Amendment, American women, finally get the right to vote. Here are some of those ladies I was just talking about that really kind of pushed this suffrage movement over the finish line. Uh, Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and obviously the right to vote is such an essential thing. And this is one thing you guys got to remember, right, in U.S. history. We've had different periods of time when different people were allowed to vote and were not allowed to vote. And sometimes progress was slow. Like I said, have been times when major groups of people have been denied that right. And that was an error. Obviously, looking back, that was something that we did incorrectly. It was wrong of us to deny the right to vote to certain people. But that was history, and we can't change it now. And we didn't live in that time. We can't understand the context exactly of that time period in our day and age. But white women get the right to vote in this country in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. And these ladies, as well as people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others, are the ones that really champion the movement, are at the forefront of the movement, and they get the job done in the end. So here you can see, kind of one of the marches, one of the protests that these women would do, and they would do these occasionally. But yeah, women's suffrage, 19th Amendment. So this is kind of the capstone, the culmination of the progressive movement, really, right? So you had workers' rights and getting rid of child labor, and uh, you had the setting aside of land for national parks and conservation efforts, and all kinds of things during the progressive movement. Prohibition, okay, and then finally women's voting rights. And to finish off here, this map shows you when women's suffrage was granted in the individual states. Um, some states and territories allowed women to vote in those places in local and state elections, obviously before they could vote on a national level. And you can see that Wyoming was the first state in 1869, and then Utah, were the second territory, state territory. We were a territory at the time, 1870. So we were second in allowing women the right to vote in our state and local elections. But by 1920, then they could vote. All women could vote in. All white women could vote in national, federal elections. So that's how this works out. But kind of cool that Utah was one, kind of one of the forerunners at the, kind of ahead of the other states and territories in allowing women the right to vote. So good stuff. But that is the progressive movement. Okay, trying to make progress in society in all these different realms, trying to bring more equality to people, and just trying to, what people thought, catch up to the times, and modernize things a little bit as far as how people should be treated. So there you go.